I'm Mike McCarthy. I was born a hemophiliac, and I got tainted blood in 1984. Growing up with hemophilia meant a lot of time in the hospital, and there was no real medicine to prevent my bleeds. And by the time the late 70s and early 80s came around, they had developed a miracle drug called Factor VIII that allowed me to inject myself with blood products that would allow me to lead a normal life, and I would be able to travel and live hopefully a full life. It happened in 1984 when I was asked to go into the clinic. We had heard some news reports that blood products could be contaminated with a virus that was fatal. It was called HIV/AIDS. And at the time, there was a lot of hysteria around it. I was identified as being one of the risk groups that could be infected by it. I went into my clinic, and they did a full physical, and they said, there's no test for AIDS, but we think you may have it because you took all these blood products when we think the products were contaminated. And so you better be really careful, and we're going to monitor you really closely, and you probably shouldn't have sex with anybody because we think it's transmittable that way. And so as a young man, I became very frightened and really, really scared in terms of, was this really happening to me when that medicine that was supposed to give me a license to live a full life was now potentially going to kill me. I had met my future wife, and we were romantically involved, and we had made plans that we were going to spend the rest of our life together, and I had to share her this potentially terrible news, and to her credit, she stood beside me. And I stopped taking blood products after I heard this from my physician, and he warned me to stop taking blood as it would probably kill me. And I iced my bleeds for 8 years, and I think I avoided the bullet of HIV, and I went into my clinic in 1992, and I was told, hey, you didn't get AIDS, but you got hepatitis C, but don't worry. Nobody knew anything about hepatitis C in 1992 other than it was something that took years to kill you. And at the time, you were just so grateful that you didn't get HIV because it killed everybody, that I felt at least my life could move forward, but I still needed to understand why I was still infected with a potentially fatal virus. It's like having the flu every day of your life. And so what you thought was, I'm really tired, I'm overworking, I feel like crap, I need to take naps, you can become jaundiced with it. It's just a deep malaise. You always feel like you have a fever. And so it was the liver being attacked by the virus, and it wasn't cleaning the blood in my body as efficiently because of the virus, and you felt run down all the time. More people died from hep C than HIV in the blood scandal in Canada, many more. It's understood at this point that there was about 3,000 people that were infected with HIV through the blood system in Canada, and over 30,000 people infected with hepatitis C in the blood system in Canada until proper screening was implemented in the 90s. I know lots of those people. They were from every walks of life, rich and poor, young and old, men and women, but belonged to somebody and had a life and had trusted the system that if they needed the gift of life, blood or blood products, that there was explicit understanding that this was safe and that this was sanctioned by our government. And so there was no thought of taking these products or getting a blood transfusion, that the need for it was far greater than any perceived risk. But of course they didn't tell us, and they certainly didn't tell me that the blood that I was taking was collected from prisons in the United States or Skid Row or from Russian funeral parlors and sent to Canada to be manufactured into blood products that went into my vein. Well, it was identified years later from the inquiry. Lots were identified that came from a prison in the United States called Cummins Prison in Arkansas. And at the height of the AIDS crisis, the FDA tried to shut the program down, and it was allowed to stay open, and all this prison blood, which was considered very risky at the time because there was limited testing, was sent to Canada to be distributed to a manufacturer here, and the rest of it was allowed to be sent worldwide to other countries. It was identified that I got some tainted batches from a prison in Arkansas that government knew about and decided to allow it to remain in the system, and me and hundreds of other hemophiliacs paid the price for that. Right? Our government, who are the regulator, understood that the manufacturer in Canada were using a blood broker in Montreal and buying plasma on the open market at the height of the AIDS crisis from the riskiest places on the planet and allowing it to be exported to Canada and to be manufactured into blood products that would be used by Canadians. It's all documented.
Why?
Well, because of money. Because there was enormous amounts of money that were put into the blood system to purchase these blood products, and there was political interference to allow a manufacturer in Canada to get the exclusive rights to manufacture hemophilia products for patients like myself. And so we were a captive audience that were essentially had no choice but to use the product that was given to us. And because it was about economic development and jobs, politicians made the decision of putting money over safety, essentially. Testing was rarely used to the full extent that it could have been. There was a number of tests that would have eliminated a large amount of contaminated blood from the system in Canada, but it was not implemented because of cost issues and the fear that they would throw safe blood out with bad blood, because there was some false positives with some of these early tests. But the point was that they didn't implement a tool that could have reduced the risk for Canadians, and it proved to be a fatal decision for people that relied on a safe blood product or a transfusion. It was known in scientific circles that the hepatitis B antigen test would remove a great deal of contaminated blood that showed positive markers for that. And AIDS traveled the same pathway that would show those markers as well, and so they could have reduced the risk for both viruses. And essentially, if they would have taken the time and used these tests that were available in the late 70s, because of the hepatitis risk, before anything was known about AIDS, we could have actually saved a lot of people, and we would have avoided the contamination of the blood supply because we would have acted on principles of safety first. Feels like I didn't matter, that the real focus of what these decisions should have been about protecting me and ensuring that I got a safe blood product that would allow me to lead a normal life was at the bottom of the decision pool. That there were so many other factors that clouded that decision making that wasn't even in consideration at the end of the day. It was about power, money, about infighting amongst the provinces, the Red Cross and the federal government of who owned the blood system, who ran it, how much it cost. The costing of the system was far more important to these people that were making decisions than was the safety of what the system should have been all about. And so that I felt abandoned, and I'm sure every Canadian who got infected through the blood system equally felt that they were thrown under the bus and their lives didn't matter. There was a concerted effort amongst the hemophilia community to try to get it to the answers before that decision was made. And it was our hope that there would be an inquiry into the contamination of the blood supply, and so we advocated strongly for that. And we were very pleased that the government decided to invoke its powers to strike a federal inquiry into the contamination of the blood supply. And so we were hopeful that we would get at to the truth of what happened. It impacted our whole group, and we needed to have answers, and we weren't given sufficient answers up to that point that, it was your bad luck, you were one in a million, it was nobody's fault. There were no acknowledgement from government or the Red Cross that anybody had done anything wrong, and it was too bad, so sad, it was God's fault. Nobody bought that. And so we were relieved when the inquiry was struck, and that Justice Horace Krever was the individual that would be leading it, as we knew he was an incredibly thorough person who wanted to get at the truth. It took a lot of public pressure to ask or demand the government to enact an inquiry. There was the media covered it extensively. The body count was adding up at a tragic, calculated amount of people that were presenting as sick or dying. And so there was huge pressure. The confidence in the blood system had plummeted. There was a lot of pressure to get at some answers so that there could be more confidence in the blood system, and it was quite evident even at that time that the public would need to see great changes in the blood system in order to believe in it again. And so government really did not have a choice. It wasn't dramatic at the beginning. We were just relieved that there was an ability for people to tell their story and that we would get at the root of the problem at some point in time. It was a process to some degree. But when the stories started being told and some of the information came out in terms of some of the decisions that were made or not made, it became quite clear that it was a tragedy that was not necessary, and we made terrible decisions. And the suffering that you heard in the testimony was way too close for home. At that point, I had lost one uncle of HIV, and my other uncle was sick with hepatitis C, and so it was bringing that story home that we were living on a daily basis anyways in terms of what was happening in our family, and the fact that I was exhibiting symptoms of advanced liver failure at the time. And so it had a personal impact of what we were hearing, and it was one of, to some degree, shock and disgust, and the sense of injustice became it was a growing thing for us to watch and to realize that there needed to be a significant answer to what was taking place at the inquiry in terms of the need to change the blood system and to hold people responsible to task. What we kept hearing the Red Cross refusing to apologize. We started to hear that Krever was in fact being slowed down by the federal government, who did not want him to release names or lay blame in his report, that he was not to go down the road for hepatitis C, that the focus should have been just on HIV, and the fact that the society brought forward the amount of people infected through hepatitis C was something that expanded his mandate. And ultimately, the kind of things that Justice Krever exposed through his exhaustive inquiry, the findings were so disturbing that the federal government took him to the Supreme Court to try to stop him from releasing his final report. And that was ironic. And we knew at that point that something was very, very wrong with the whole system, and that Justice Krever had uncovered some unbelievable, terrible decisions that had impacted the system negatively, that led to the loss of health and life of many people. And this report had to come out in order for us to be able to learn from these mistakes, in order for us to build a new safe blood system, and hopefully provide some justice to people that were harmed through the blood system. For me, the report was significant on multiple factors, but the most important was he made his first recommendation about the victims, about how they needed to be supported and they needed to have some type of retribution or financial support for what had happened to them. That was imperative for the blood system to move forward, to have the proper reforms, that the past would be taken care of, and that these people that were harmed through no fault of their own would be provided the kind of support that was needed, that they could get on with the rest of their lives, so that they could live with the terrible pain that they had and the diseases that they had acquired through the blood system. I believe that was, for us, for people that were harmed through the blood system, was the most significant part of the report, and it was right up front and center. And it was telling how important that was by the government of trying to avoid agreeing that they would follow his number one recommendation. And that, to me, signified that there was going to be a fight for justice even after his report. His report also did name names and lay blame, laid bare the tragedy for Canadians to read and to come to their own conclusions that it was an avoidable disaster of unprecedented magnitude in Canadian history, the largest public health disaster in our country's history, was totally avoidable. Decisions that were made that were negligent, that put Canadians in harm's way needlessly, was apparent on multiple fronts through lack of action, through delay, through starving the system for appropriate funding, for political meddling, and a multitude of other terrible decisions that led to the tragedy. And so the report was exhaustive and irrefutable with the evidence that went along with it that was produced with the report, 3 volumes. It was an unbelievable impact to the public health system in this country. And in fact, with his report, he Kreverized the healthcare system in this country, which really meant, and his principle was, you don't wait for the body count. You act on the principle of safety first. Safety is paramount, and you make decisions based on probabilities that harm could happen to Canadians. And so the decisions on a go-forward basis through his report would be about eliminating as much risk as possible, and that safety decisions took precedent over financial decisions. And that was a tremendous document that was a gift to all Canadians, not just for the blood system, but for the health system, to remind our operators of health systems, our custodians of institutions, our regulator who are supposed to look after the best interests of Canadians, that their job one is to protect the public. And the public needed to be reminded of that. And all those players needed to be reminded of that. And I think we have a health system and a blood system now that has carried most of those principles forward. The patient and the victim was supposed to get help, and it was supposed to be all of them. The government arbitrarily decided of who would get help, and it would be those people that had the greatest opportunity to win a lawsuit in the court of law, and so there was the systems were trying to avoid responsibility for helping people that were harmed through the blood system by saying God gave all them infections and the rest of them was just a mistake, and we'll give them money because we would lose that case in the court of law. Well, I was before that arbitrary date of 86 to 1990. I got prison blood in 1984. That was egregious misstep and bad decisions by government. And so people like myself and others that were outside that window, as Krever pointed out, the decision-making that led to the contamination of the blood supply happened well before that arbitrary date of 1986 to 1990. And so the government ignored that, which was the principal basis of his recommendations and his report. The second piece, the institutions did not want to give up their existing roles, and that there had to be a great deal of advocating to see the end of the Red Cross. They were essentially booted out of the blood system at some point in time because there was zero confidence, and there had to be a rebuilding of trust for Canadians, and that was really important to happen. But justice for victims that were harmed through the blood system, that had to be advocated by victims themselves, who had to go to the police and the RCMP to ask for a probe or ask for charges. And if that patient voice wasn't active even after Krever's report, we wouldn't have seen at least some sense of justice in terms of the RCMP did an exhaustive investigation that led to multiple charges, that led to a conviction of the Red Cross, who had to apologize in the public setting and had a $1 million fine. We weren't able to be successful in the rest of the criminal charges. Because of the scope of the charges, it was difficult to get a conviction. But at the very least, we felt that we had won our court case in the court of public opinion. And what that did was to scare the operators and those that run institutions that there's a price to pay if you make a bad decision, which would include going to court to stand on charges that led to the loss of health and life of people. So it was the victim's voice that carried Krever's report forward to basically force the government to live up to the principles of what Krever had set out. You know, all that 5 years of supporting Krever and getting to the truth and all that he laid bare in terms of the negligence of the blood system, and somehow the government didn't have the right response, was what the public wanted, what victims wanted, what everybody needed, was to be able to allow people to get on with their lives by recognizing that the failings occurred far before that arbitrary date. And it was an insult to many, many people that there would be haves and have-nots to get support from the government for what happened. It was well documented that the system was contaminated as early as the late 70s, early 80s. And so that meant that we had to do something. And so I decided as an individual that I would fight back, in the sense of I launched a class action that was the largest lawsuit in the history of this country for people that were excluded, that sent a message to the government that this isn't over. Just because Krever put his report out and you ignored it, that this is not over. And we took the case to the public, and we dogged and we followed the blood trail along with politicians that were for and against this. And mostly it was, we found that we had a lot of support in the public, and we had a lot of support from opposition in other provinces that felt maybe the right decision wasn't made. But it really took a long fight to get the federal government on side to decide that, hey, let's open this up and provide help to everybody. It took years, and that was something that many people spent the rest of their lives, even though they were sick and dying at the time, that they could not rest until there was true justice for people. And this was an advocacy fight that took many shapes and forms, that was on the front pages of the papers for 10 years after Krever's report came out, to try to make sure that there was justice for everybody. And it was, I think, somewhat rewarding that the little guy could fight back, and that you could fight City Hall, and that you could win if the truth was on your side and justice was on your side. And I had the Krever inquiry report that I could always fall back on and say, it was Krever who said this, not me. I'm only bringing this out to tell people that the government got it wrong, and that we need to do the right thing. If this is important for the building up of trust for the blood system, to put the past to rest, people needed to have closure to their lives, that this act of generosity from the Canadian people to help them in their hour of need, that would happen. And this was a long fight, and at times very bitter, and sometimes very dark, but perseverance and the belief that you're on the right side, and that voice needed to be heard for Canadians to act upon. And Tainted Blood victims basically took the bull by the horns and showed the Canadian public, and certainly showed the Canadian politicians, that sometimes when you make the wrong decision, it doesn't go away, and you can't put the coffin lid on it and say that file is closed, because it's only closed when there's justice for all. Blood is, by nature, can be risky because it comes from the human body, and there's various viruses that are circulating in nature that could show up in humans at some point, as we've seen in the past with hepatitis and AIDS. And so the principles of what Krever pointed out was that you gotta make decisions that will protect the unknown from the unknown. And so up till now, I think with what we went through with Krever, and the Canadian Blood Services was formed from the ashes of the Red Cross, that there was a great deal of support and motivation to make sure that we didn't repeat the mistakes of the past. And for the last 15 years, we've had a blood system that I think we can be proud of in this country. But in the last 3 years, we've seen some troubling decisions by Health Canada again, and by Canadian Blood Services and the provinces, to allow the advent of the paid donor model to be competing against the public model in Canada. And that means paying people to donate their plasma, as they do down in the United States. And we know from the past, the people that used to donate plasma in the United States came from the most high-risk areas. And the screening was very poor, and the systems, not only in Canada, but around the world, became infected because they used that paid donor model for blood products that were manufactured. We did not take heed of Krever's one recommendation, was that we become self-sufficient in the public system so that we can make all our blood products from volunteer blood donors, because they are the safer donor, because they're not incentivized by money to lie in order to donate. Yes, the system is safer now with testing that has been pretty solid for the last 15 years with no new infections, but it's the new infection that we have to be wary of, the new virus, and you want to ensure that your donor is one that's motivated for the right reason, so they're not going to lie. And so to this very day, the paid donor model that they tried to introduce in Ontario was set up beside homeless shelters and a methadone clinic, where in science, these are risky donors. And they said, don't worry, we got it this time. The science is better. Well, I heard that in the past. And you know what? The model may work in the United States, but why do we need to implement that up in Canada when there is no shortage of plasma in Canada? It's gone back to that same principle that we got into trouble in the 1970s and 1980s, and that is money started to impact decision making in the blood system, which is happening again. It's about economic development, it's about making money, it's about jobs, and this is the kind of stuff that, once again, people glass over in Health Canada, and the regulator, who should be the last person that should be licensing these paid for models up in Canada, and our operator, Canadian Blood Services, who really stood on the sidelines and said, we'll watch it carefully. Well, we know now with the one clinic that has opened up in Saskatchewan that we've seen a loss of donors that we will never get back again. And we need to take a careful look at where we're going here. And that's why the job of advocacy has never really ended, and that we still use the principles of Krever to point out, again, safety's not just important, it's paramount. And so we're backsliding. Looks like we're headed down the same pathway again. I certainly don't want to be around for the next Tainted Blood crisis. And that's why myself and others that had survived the scandal put our hands up again and said, not this time. Have we not learned from the past? And so we've been very effective as a advocacy group called Blood Watch, that we're the watchdog of the blood system to ensure that the lessons that Krever pointed out that we needed to learn from the past aren't repeated again. And that's why the Canadian public continued to need to understand that this particular piece of history is something that we're all living with to this very day, and that for the grace of God, we could go down that road again. And so we need to continue to be vigilant to ensure that good decisions are made for the benefit of Canadians. The fact that people have to, as individuals, have to take on their own government and essentially themselves to try to get at the truth, and while it's hidden because of fear of having to go before the courts for bad decisions, having to have individuals take the government on to get to the truth is an onerous task, and not one for the faint of heart. And people that are sick and dying don't have a lot of energy to begin with, and for them to spend the rest of their lives to try to get at the truth is a very cruel thing. And for government not to be transparent and honest and come forward to make things right, put a little bit of suspicion in our minds that justice can be really fleeting, and it can be manipulated by government, by their media spin that basically said, here's justice from our perspective, and here's who we're going to help. And to have to leave it up to the public to take them on over what is basically fake news now, and to continue to fight to ensure that the truth gets told, is a huge burden. But one, on the other side, is tremendously reassuring that you can fight City Hall and you can fight back and you can win those battles. But it's a big mountain to climb. So justice is there, but it's really fleeting for many people.